My name's Mary Coleman. I'm managing editor for Public News Service. I have 2 decades of radio broadcast media experience. I started with Public News Service 14 years ago, or 15 as a reporter, covering several states and producing newscasts. And I now serve as managing editor, where I work with reporters and then field story pitches from organizations and other groups and kind of help craft them as well for stories that we air through Public News Service. What is Public News Service? We're a news wire for public interest reporting. 39 state news services across the country, and we are growing. We distribute to 30,000 outlets a day and are heard by 50 million people a week, mostly on local radio, primarily rural and underserved markets, and heard on formats such as talk radio, low power community, top 40, adult contemporary, religious broadcasting, Spanish language, etc. And our audience is geographically and ideologically and demographically diverse. We are member supported by organizations who fund a beat on various issues, and you can learn more at publicnewsservice.org. Let's start with journalists, the folks you want to run your stories, right? Who are they? Journalism is always trying to do more with less. It's a consolidating industry, so there's pressure to be as efficient as possible. Journalists are always on deadline for publications coming out every day or newscasts coming out every day. There's deadlines you constantly have to meet as a journalist, and they're constantly inundated at the same time with pitches and press releases and just emails. And sometimes it's just doing a lot of triage when it comes to their work. So making their job easier is a win for you, a win for them. Getting them the materials that they need to get a story out is very helpful because it helps elevate your profile and message on the issues that are important to your organization, while at the same time helping them out a little bit and making their job easier. And it's important to note that many small and mid-sized outlets no longer have editorial staff, and they actually rely on syndicated content. That's where the stuff that Public News Service does really comes into play. We release stories that are just ready to read to them. Let's start with diving into what is the story. And so let's talk about message. Start always with your mission when it comes to pitching the media. It may sound very basic, but go back to your mission statement. What do you want to do? What's the change that you want to see in the world? It's important because it informs kind of what comes next. Think about what you're doing, the work that you're trying to get done, and why that's relevant is really what the story is. Are you trying to work on something that's already in the news, something on people's minds, a trend or an event? It's good to think about, do these things tie? Does your work tie into any of these things to make them a little bit more newsworthy? And when we distribute our stories to news directors, one of the main questions we think about is, why is this story relevant to the community today? Because that's something that a news director is going to think about. Like, does my listener want to hear about this? Or should they want to hear about this? They just don't know, right? So that's kind of the way news directors think. And it's things to keep in mind when you're crafting your story, right? So think about, why is this relevant to the community today? That's an important question to consider. Is this something that people in the community can connect to, or is it going to move them to take action or to want to learn more and pay attention? And can you marry heart and mind? Can you connect a personal story to the data? That always helps make something a little bit more newsworthy, personal, right? And another important thing to think of is leading with the lead. What is this, what is the thing, the one sentence, the word, the message that you want people who are going to hear this to think about and to pay attention to? So put that at the forefront, right at the beginning. So here's some examples that we will go into. So PR Newswire, a great place to go. Look for ideas of how people craft news releases, good and bad. Here's an example of one that we didn't find to be the best. You can read them. This is example 1, right? It's a documentary that got a fiscal sponsorship. Now, is that a newsworthy story? I would argue not really. To me, it looks more like PR. But even if it's not, within this press release, as we look at it, we've got the quote and all this, but we don't learn about what the issue is until the bottom, the last paragraph. It's about, emergency first responders who deal with PTSD and the impact that that could possibly even have on the community. So that right there is your story. And then you would possibly follow that up with, and there's some new funding that came for it to make sure that more people can see this film. So this is just an example of one that's not crafted too well, right? Here's an example of one that's a little bit better. In contrast, we have an Easter Seals release. They've got a 10-point plan asking businesses to commit to a diverse and inclusive workplace. So right up top, right at the beginning, they lead with a really great statistic, very good statistic. And then they get into what they want. Second sentence and why essentially it's relevant to the local community. They get it all in right there. So that's a better example of a good news release that might catch attention a little bit more. And even down here, we see that they have their 10-point plan highlighted and a little bit of bold that always grabs the eye. And then we have a public news service story kind of as an example here. This story, we really try to get the local angle. For a better garden, leave the leaves, right? So looking at this, the autumn to-do list, all of this, but it really goes into why leaving your leaves on the ground is important to the people of New York. And we have a local person being quoted as to why it's important and environmentally smart and brief and to the point. So those are things you're going to want to think about. And like I said, maybe check out PR Newswire when you're doing these things. And then the other point when we look at what is the story is keep in mind your executive director is not your audience and you are not your audience for who you're pitching your story to. It's important to put yourself in the shoes of the people who are receiving your message and consider the ways that they're going to perceive the story. So next, let's go to what are you trying to do? So this is another thing to think about with your story pitch. Who are you trying to reach a little bit? Are you trying to build awareness? Are you trying to change public policy? Are you trying to inform communities about your issues? Are you trying to raise money, expand programming? Are you trying to sell tickets? All these goals correspond to different audiences and targets. It's important to consider who you're trying to reach, right? Who is your audience? Who do you want to see the earned media from this story? We can't speak to all people all the time. So think about what audience corresponds to each goal. Is it your boss and your board, donors and funders, volunteers, thought leaders, potential clients, affected communities, elected officials and their constituencies, specific geographic communities? Now that could apply to everything above. So something to think about is just being as specific as possible in your own mind. And you can do that by mapping it out, right? Make a mind map. Here's just an example of something you could think about. So if your goal is to change policy, your target's going to be thought leaders, elected officials, donors, and funders. If your goal is to build awareness of issues, then that's going to be thought leaders, elected officials, donors, and funders, and affected communities. That's a much broader group. And then if you're just looking to inform about services, that would be the affected communities and donors and funders. So this kind of map on paper or wherever you want to do it on a whiteboard, it might help you figure out how to narrow your pitch and make it perfect for the story that you're looking for. So back to reporters and journalists, they are people. And reporters don't need to be your friend, but any good professional relationship is built on communication. And so follow up after you send your pitch. You email it. If you don't hear back, follow up, maybe make a phone call. Journalists are trained to pick up their phones. They're used to working quickly. And that also means you should pick up your phone. So if you send a pitch out and your phone number's on that press, at least be prepared to answer the phone. Another idea, and this is a little less in today's world with people working from home a lot more, but if you're in a situation where you're working near the state capitol or things like that, hang out where journalists hang out, state capitals, go to public meetings, stay afterwards, get to know them. And don't be afraid of background conversations. Journalists often just want to know your angle and why you're talking to them. So be open about it and letting them know that what maybe the goal of your story is. A very important one is to constantly update your contact lists. Local media is a transient industry. And I do think this can happen too, like in the communications field also. People come and go. So maybe pick a time, maybe quarterly, that once a day or, one day every quarter where you go through your list, you make those calls and make sure that the person that you're sending stuff to is still the person doing the job. So it's just not going out there and no one's seeing it. And so there are some tips specifically for working with radio producers. Often one news director or one reporter, right, is doing top and bottom of the hour news for a cluster of stations that are all in different formats. And so public news radio is a more normal kind of reporter relationship, but they're busy, right? I mean, that's the point. They've got a lot going on. They're on the air. They're on the phone. And broadcast news actually has a different formatting. So we look at those press releases and you saw that P&S story. That's the print version of a story we would do. And I don't actually have that exact example, but I have a different one. This is what our stories look like that are sent to radio outlets. It's written for reading. We call it a rip and read, the idea of a typewriter, and you rip the paper off and you'd run into the studio and you read it into the mic, right? But it's written for radio. And then our stories are translated into web format, like the other one you saw. But think about this. And as you craft a press release, try to think, especially if you're pitching for radio, does this sound like a radio story? So keep that in mind. You don't have to write a story, but keep your press release, just think about that. Can your press release be easily turned into a radio story? Or does it read like something dry that's from, a college textbook or something like that? All right. So if you're also pitching broadcast journalists, make sure your spokespeople are prepped for live sound and ready to answer the phone. This can be difficult. I encounter it sometimes where somebody, says, hey, so-and-so is going to, this is the person you should talk to. And you call that person and they have no idea that they were suggested for an interview. They don't know what the topic's about, or they don't know what they should speak to. They might know the topic, but they don't know what angle that the group was hoping they'd be able to speak about. So just make sure that they're prepped, and that can make the process go a lot quicker. And then another idea, and I actually haven't seen this a lot, but it's easily done in today's, world of technology. You can actually record sound of the quotes that you put into your press release and send it along with your pitch. Say, hey, here's actual quotes from our executive director, that you could just pop into a radio story. They'd love that. So those are some tips for radio producers. So to kind of recap a few things, don't write a press release, write it kind of like a story, right? To grab the eye. And know the goal of what you're pitching just beyond you want to see pickup. You want to see that media outlets to pick this up. Just know the goal. Is it building awareness? Is it changing policy? Is it informing communities? And then know who needs to hear your story to achieve that goal, and figure out maybe the best medium to reach them. Do a little bit of research. Newspapers are different than radio, and online outlets and blogs are a little bit different too. If you're looking for rural people, radio, like I said, like Public News Service does a lot of rural radio outreach. And so radio might be your best bet if it's something where you're targeting more of a rural audience. And then, of course, make it easy for journalists to use your pitch. It's going to get used a lot quicker. Like that Easter seal story, I'd pick up a lot quicker than the one about the film if the film one had just been written a little differently, maybe. And so when it comes also to evaluating all your media, not just, how many people did we reach, but did we reach the people that helped us achieve that goal, right? So it's not always about having this huge number. It's more about, did it get to that rural audience we were looking for? So don't take a single data point, an indicator of future success when it comes to your media work. And so that's what I have as far as media outreach and tips for pitching journalists. That's my contact information if you ever wanted to reach out. I do appreciate your time today, and thank you so much.